Right into it. So we're welcome. I will skip the introductions in the interest of time, but we will jump right into our three panelists. So, Mary, do you want to go first?
Sure. Thank you, Bruce. And let's see, is it on? Okay, great. It's a pleasure to be here today. And, the breadth of the industries that are represented on the two panels today is certainly a testament to the importance of trade and NAFTA in general. As the voice of the world's leading food, beverage, and consumer product companies, GMA sits uniquely at the intersection of manufacturing, agriculture, and a range of other value chain industries. The U.S. food, beverage, and consumer products industry today is incredibly dynamic. You may be surprised to know that our industry is the single largest employer in U.S. manufacturing, and we have been consistently driving growth and employment in the U.S. economy. We directly employ 2.1 million Americans in 30,000 communities across the United States, an estimated 16% of all U.S. manufacturing employment. And we add $1 trillion of value every year to the U.S. economy. These are good, high-paying jobs, and employment in food manufacturing has grown in recent years, while other manufacturing employment has declined. In addition to the men and women employed directly, our industry's economic activity supports an additional 9 million jobs across the value chain. That's nearly 4.5 additional jobs for every direct job in the industry. And finally, overall employment directly and indirectly attributable to our industry represents roughly 6% of total U.S. employment. So what do we see for the future in the NAFTA context and in the trade context more broadly? Our industry makes tens of thousands of safe, affordable products consumers rely on every day. And the innovations that these products represent means that hardworking American families spend less of their disposable income on food than in any other industrialized economy. But more than 95% of the world's potential consumers live outside the United States. So access to foreign markets is a key component of future growth and competitiveness for our industry. Consumers in emerging markets are increasingly urban, with growing incomes that lead to improved standards of living. We see great growth potential as these consumers demand the high quality, safe, affordable, and convenient products that our members make. Trade liberalization has had a huge impact as our industry has benefited from a steady decline in tariffs globally over the past several decades, including the reductions achieved as a result of NAFTA. Exports of U.S. processed food and beverage products have grown steadily, contributing to the overall U.S. agricultural trade surplus. What we need to do now, at the risk of being overly simplistic, is to promote, protect, and expand those gains in order to increase our competitiveness and growth and employment. Just to underscore the impact, U.S. processed food and beverage exports to the world totaled almost $40 billion in 2016. That's roughly 1/3 of all U.S. agricultural exports. Of those global processed food and beverage exports, roughly half, almost $18 billion, were destined for Canada and Mexico. And that $18 billion represents more than half of the $31 billion in overall U.S. agricultural exports to Canada and Mexico. NAFTA eliminated nearly all tariffs on processed food and beverages. Some products had faced pre-NAFTA tariffs as high as 20 to 40%, for example, those on chocolates and processed meats. NAFTA also allows U.S. food and beverage manufacturers to source and import high-quality ingredients that are not grown or even available in the United States. This includes oats, coffee, spices, cocoa, packaging inputs, and similar products. NAFTA did more than just reduce tariffs. It also instituted rules for sanitary and phytosanitary measures and technical barriers to trade that committed Canada and Mexico to ensure regulations are based in science, don't discriminate against U.S. products, and don't restrict trade more than necessary. The agreement's investment protections also remove significant barriers, protecting U.S. investors from discriminatory treatment. In the 2 decades since NAFTA, we have seen the development of a high degree of supply chain integration in the North American market. U.S. manufacturers have substantial investments in Mexico, and there are major Mexican investments in the U.S. food industry. U.S. and Canada, benefiting from an even longer history of free trade together, have substantial direct investment both ways. And there is significant and growing trade in intermediate ingredients and products as well. As others have said, NAFTA is over 24 years old this month, really. As I recall, that's when the implementation law was passed. We think it can be improved to bring it into the 21st century and to create an even stronger North American market. In fact, we have worked closely with our counterpart associations in both Canada and Mexico to develop some ways to do just that, and we're happy to know that those ideas have been well received in all 3 countries. With the benefit of 2 decades of experience, the parties negotiating NAFTA 2.0 have the chance to incorporate standards and disciplines that go beyond the current NAFTA and WTO commitments and set a high bar against burdensome and non-science-based trade barriers. Such an agreement could become a new model for future U.S. trade agreements and for Mexican and Canadian agreements as well. And I think all 3 countries see the potential for that, which they should. A gold standard NAFTA 2.0 for the 21st century, in our view, should achieve 2 things. It should remove any remaining market access barriers, and it should upgrade provisions for science-based, predictable, and transparent regulatory decision-making. Specifically, we think the parties under NAFTA 2.0 should commit to several broad objectives. First, ensure that science, risk, and good regulatory practices are the foundation for developing regulations intended to protect public health and safety. These would mirror U.S. policy frameworks. For example, this could include meaningful public consultation and rulemaking, robust risk assessment, management and communication, streamlined custom requirements, and so forth. Second, the parties should agree to align regulations to reduce unnecessary differences and the associated costs, particularly when the conceptual regulatory frameworks are already very similar. And third, the parties should reinforce and expand their regulatory cooperation efforts. For example, the existing U.S.-Canada Regulatory Cooperation Council should be made permanent and continue to advocate and advance cooperation in areas like food safety and chemicals management. We think the level of ambition should be improved between U.S. and Mexico on regulatory cooperation, and there should be some mechanism for trilateral regulatory cooperation. So just to conclude, we need a strong North American market. Several of the previous panelists talked about its importance not just as a North American market, but vis-a-vis the rest of the world and U.S. competitiveness overall. And so we look forward to working with the administration, as we have from the beginning, to express our concerns and our priorities and our commitment to work with them on a modernized NAFTA. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Let me ask Owen Herrnstadt from the International Association of Machinists.
Thank you, Bruce. The International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers is probably the most diverse manufacturing union in North America, with sizable memberships in aerospace, shipbuilding, woodworking, manufacturing, electronics, auto parts, and so forth on it. Our members produce, manufacture, service, and transport the goods that indeed make up the global economy. We are very well aware of how important trade is. We're very well aware of how important the global economy is. At the same time, we're also very well aware about how current U.S. trade policy has failed workers here at home and throughout the world, and of course their communities as well. Through weak rules of origin rules, even weaker labor chapters, labor provisions, rules that can impact domestic procurement laws concerning Buy American rules, and of course, private rights of action for corporations to challenge regulations made by state and local communities. All of these things have assisted in the outflow of work in the United States to other countries that don't respect fundamental human rights. And because they don't respect fundamental human rights, they can obtain lower labor costs that is not based on a free and open labor market. And through these lower labor costs, they unfairly compete with U.S. manufacturers who want to retain work and keep manufacturing here at home in the United States, and at the same time, they put U.S. workers in an untenable position of being forced to compete with companies that move work overseas to take advantage of lower costs based on violations of these lower fundamental human rights. And let me take each of these. I'll spend a little bit of time on each of them, but I don't want to spend too much time. Before doing that, let me give you some numbers. You should be pretty familiar with them, that show the real brunt of how workers are being left out in the cold in terms of U.S. trade policy. Now, first of all, we've lost about 6 million manufacturing jobs over the last 10, 12, 15 years. Not all of those obviously are due to trade, but it's a sizable number, and it shows you the depth of what is occurring in our own U.S. manufacturing industries. 850,000 jobs, as reported by the Economic Policy Institute, have been lost due to NAFTA. 3.4 million jobs, according to EPI, have been lost since China PNTR came into being. Between 50,000 and 87,000 factories have closed in the last several years. It's a wide range of numbers, depends on how you actually count them. Real wages have declined or been at best static in the U.S. Unless you have a collective bargaining agreement, then they've gone up. And mere threats by companies in the U.S. and Canada, for that matter, to move work to Mexico in an effort to crush workers' rights to form their own union and to engage in collective bargaining still continue. I recall when NAFTA was first enacted, one of the areas in the Midwest where we were organizing, and a plant manager came up wearing a sombrero and said to workers, yeah, well, you know, if you organize the union here, we'll all be wearing sombreros because we're moving the work to Mexico on that. Threats like that are taken for real. When work was moved out of Maytag in Galesburg, Illinois, one of the last workers there warned other manufacturing workers in the U.S. To be aware that NAFTA is coming for them. That was their words, not mine, on it. At the same time, work has not improved. The standard of living hasn't improved for workers in Mexico. Wages are decreasing, if not stagnant as well, incredibly low. Our own State Department describes workers' rights in Mexico still in very troubling words. Things like workers exercise their rights to freedom of association and collective bargaining with difficulty. Similarly, low opinions about how child labor was being prohibited, as well as forced or prison labor as well in Mexico. And there are a lot of different reasons for it. A lot of reasons have to do with a weak labor chapter. NAFTA, of course, didn't even have a labor chapter. It was an aside agreement. But even the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, the proposed agreement, contained a very weak labor chapter, which we opposed. It laid out various barriers for filing complaints under that labor chapter. First of all, it used a standard of the Declaration of Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work, and had a footnote excluding ILO conventions which help interpret those principles and rights at work. It also required that for a violation to stick, it had to be in a manner affecting trade and investment. And we know from the recent ruling with Guatemala how conservative that language could be interpreted. In that case, several workers were discriminated against for union activity but yet the panel refused to find a violation. Even if those are met, the violation itself still has to be in a sustained or reoccurring fashion, whatever that means, leaving out, of course, serious violations. But that's only just part of the method in terms of the weak labor violations themselves. We mentioned a lot about rules of origin. I don't want to take up too much time on that, but it is a weak rules of origin. We are very, very concerned about pass-throughs that occur when work is performed in China or Thailand, and countries that fail to honor fundamental human rights can take full benefits under NAFTA by using weak rules of origin. And the same goes for a concept called substantial transformation, a magical idea that a foreign part can somehow be substantially transformed into a part that can receive, or a component that can receive the benefits of NAFTA. And it's not just true for auto, it's true for aerospace and other manufactured goods as well. I should also note, in terms of aerospace, since NAFTA, Mexico's own aerospace industry has grown by leaps and bounds, with over 30,000 workers now in Mexico, performing some of the most technologically advanced work imaginable on that, still at low wage rates, and still in a country where fundamental human rights are to be questioned. And then the last 2 points, I'll be quiet, is we also object, obviously, to the Investor-to-State Dispute Resolution Mechanism, or ISDS, and of course, we share with others about how trade should fix the issues of currency valuation, and as I mentioned before, real issues dealing with procurement. It is absolutely critical that the U.S. be able to maintain its Buy America laws. We've talked about how they should be stronger. Much of the country has been talking about made in the USA. We need to firm those issues as well. Last but not least, on rules of origin, let me also mention we have serious issues about how domestic content can actually be calculated, not just only in trade agreements, but throughout the U.S. government. There are various methods to calculate content. We've been arguing for years. The Federal Trade Commission has a Made in the USA policy saying it has to be substantially sourced and made in the U.S. We are troubled that that same definition can't extend throughout government policy, including trade as well. So I'll end there. Thank you, Bruce.
Great, thank you, Owen. Christine Bliss from the